The first session we had today was about a new kind of politics, and in a way this blends into that because I'm speaking, rather pompous term, political theologian. And part of what political theologians try to do is look at the interrelation between religion and its effectiveness in doing a new way of politics. Now, one of the underlying dicta on this comes from a rather unsavory character from the last century. I'll mention a bit more about him later on. Carl Schmitt, who's a kind of legal theorist, got caught up in Nazism and so on, not a pleasant man. But one of his dicta was that every secular political concept, every concept that claims to be secular, is in fact, has a religious ancestry. There's a hidden theology at work. So there is no such thing as a secular reality. And a lot of the knots that our secular politics gets into comes about because it doesn't really acknowledge its dependency upon theology. That's one of the more acceptable things that Schmitt said, and I'm going to be picking up on that. What I'd specifically like to kind of look is the way that Schmitt keeps popping up his head in contemporary politics, but in particular, I want to try and make sense of something that's very disconcerting for a lot of us who are attached to the work of René Girard. Now, Girard's thought overlaps with Schmitt's in some important respects, and that is one of the reasons why Girard has been taken up by very prominent figures in the present American US administration. Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal, very much in on Facebook and so on, is the figure behind J.D. Vance, and one of the people who's introduced Vance to Girard's ideas. And I am very perplexed at what's going on there. And the Girardians who met last week in Rome were also very perplexed. Come to that meeting in a moment. But theology is back, with J.D. Vance proclaiming that there is an ordo amoris, citing Augustine, citing Aquinas, which justifies prioritizing love of family and kin over more distant claims upon our compassion. I'd love to know who instructed this man, bringing him into the Catholic Church, but that brought a reasonably swift response from Pope Francis through the American bishops saying no. And among other things, that vision of the Catholic faith is basically looking after the inner circle of your family and friends, and then if there's any compassion left, it works its way outwards. That is not what Fratelli Tutti says. It's very much at odds with the spirit of Francis' notion of social love. For Francis, the challenge was to build bridges, not walls. His encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, grounds its call for a new way of doing politics. First of all, in the figure of St. Francis. Remember, he talks about visiting to the Sultan. And then in Luke's account of the Good Samaritan, the response to the question, who is my neighbour? And if anything has changed, we're talking about how this reads now compared to 5 years ago, you kind of, well, the parable is a parable of indifference. The two men who should have helped and could have helped, they walk by the other side. Now the parable seems to be more like you see the man in the ditch and you go over and give him a good kick. There's a performative cruelty that's going on. It's not simply indifference, it is a performative cruelty, and it is energizing for an awful lot of people. Now, Girard put his finger on all of that in ways I think were very, very helpful. But in diagnosing that, it seems that some people have taken up the kind of diagnosis. The meeting I mentioned last week, the meeting of the Girardians in Rome, had some of my big theological heroes there. William T. Kavanagh was one of the speakers. Rowan Williams was another one. He happened to be in Rome. He was roped into the conference. And one of the things we're trying to do is look at the ways in which we, as Girardian scholars, have a responsibility to make sure that Girard's work is not misapplied, misdirected in this way, because there are convergences between the kind of pessimism that you can find in Girard and the way in which that's being exploited by some of the far right. And we as the kind of scholars, we need to try and be conscious of that. There's a meme going around with Girard and a MAGA cap on. But there are memes going around with Jesus and a MAGA cap, so that's hardly surprising. But to try and delve what's going on theologically, I think, is quite interesting. And what's going on? What's going on with this kind of Girardian theory that is of interest to these thinkers? I would suggest, well, basically this character, Carl Schmitt, two themes that you recognize immediately when you hear of them. He was responsible for the friend-enemy distinction. Politics is about having friends and having enemies, making alliances and having a clear sense of who your foes are. And any attempt to water that down or dilute that will end up with a very ineffective politics. So if you haven't got any enemies, you better invent some. And you can see that in going on performativity now in California. I think President Trump couldn't wait to send those troops in and to attack. Whereas everyone else is trying to calm the situation down, he's trying to escalate it so it becomes clear who the friend enemy is. Another concept from Carl Schmitt is the notion of what's called the state of exception. Real political power comes with the ability to decide on who is above the law and who is not constrained by the law. So when you have, once again, Trump channeling his inner Napoleon by saying, the man who saves his country is not subject to the law. And that's straight out of a 20th century thinker who was pointing up the inadequacy of the political system of his day. So you go back 100 years to the Weimar failure of democracy. Thinkers like Thiel are drawing directly on that. They're saying politics has run out of steam, has run out of energy, it's no longer possible. Let's push the crisis to its extremes and then start again. This idea of move fast and break things. There's a direct line between some of the thinking that was going on 100 years ago and what's being talked about now and put into action now. So what you've got, as I say, with both Schmitt and Girard, you have this sense of the fragility of democracy, the fragility of the kind of Western order. But whereas for Girard, it's the Christian gospel that helps us to work away with that. For Thiel, it's an opportunity to smash the system and start again. There's a very unpleasant kind of interview where he talks about his own religious beliefs. Thiel himself, not Christian formally, as opposed to J.D. Vance, who did become Catholic. Here's this little quotation from Thiel, and he cites Schmitt directly, but he also says, "One suspects that democracy, whatever that means, is exhausted. We have to ask some questions very far outside the Overton window. The Overton window is the range of subjects and arguments politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time." So we need to be asking questions outside the Overton window. The paradox is that's exactly what Francis is doing. He wants to shift the window. He wants to shift the framework of what is imaginable within politics. So the danger is that you get these kind of mirror images. But Thiel makes it clear. He says he would prefer the Church of Constantine to the Church of Mother Teresa. He wants a church of power, invest in political power, rather than a powerless church. And he does say at one point, two-word rebuttal of Roman Catholicism. Why I'm not a Catholic? Guess what the two words are? Pope Francis. For people like Thiel, Francis is or was a joke. Fratelli Tutti is a joke. And until we somehow riposte to that, engage with it on one level, you can't rationally engage with that, but there is a real difficulty there. Fratelli Tutti does not exist in a vacuum. The vision it presents is not outside of these political tensions, and somehow we need to be able to articulate this and recognize the degree of realism that needs to go with that. Fratelli Tutti is not utopian, we are told. Well, is that the case? How then does it take shape? And we need to kind of look at the ways in which this vision can be grounded, and recognizing, I think with a little dose of Girardian pessimism, the realities that are there. I remain convinced that John Lennon's Imagine is the silliest song that was ever written. That's a recipe for dystopia, not utopia. The idea you erase all the differences that exist. So you're coming from Liverpool, that doesn't mean anything, or you're coming from Northeast. Try telling a Muslim their faith doesn't actually matter. Are you going to increase tension or decrease it? So I think it's a very silly song. And that's us done. So I think, can we make sure that Fratelli Tutti isn't reduced to some kind of glib, imagine-type optimism? Because I think that's the challenge that's facing us, and making sure it's got credibility, because there are alternatives out there that are capturing people's imagination. Thank you.